Right. This short presentation covers the Great Awakening and its impact on the colonies leading up to the Revolution. There is a note sheet that's available in the notes to the video. If you click on it, you can follow along if you so choose. So, the Great Awakening broadly is a religious revival that impacts the English colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. The movement comes more or less in response to the Enlightenment, during which time religion had grown stale and oftentimes formalized. In many different ways, religion had become less personal during the early 18th century. Christians were beginning to feel complacent with their methods of worship, and many were growing disillusioned. Many people began to think that there was another way. Maybe there was time for a revival. Maybe it was time for another way of approaching religion. Now, the American 13 colonies at this time were anything if unified. In fact, the 13 colonies were hopelessly divided religiously. The middle colonies were made up of a myriad different groups, including Quakers, Anglicans, Lutherans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and so on and so forth. The southern colonies were mostly dominated by the Anglican Church, but also there were many Baptists and Presbyterians. And finally, of course, most of New England belonged to the Congregationalist Church that were Calvinist in nature. In the late 1720s, a revival began to take root as preachers altered their messages and began to re-emphasize the teachings of John Calvin. The teachings of John Calvin stress the importance of Scripture, faith, and especially the concept of predestination. In the concept of predestination, one is either a member of the elect or one is a member of the damned, which means God has chosen or foreseen, depending upon which version you choose to accept, as to who is going to heaven and who is going to hell before you were even born. There were a few major ministers preaching during the Great Awakening that are critical to understanding the movement. One is Jonathan Edwards. He was from Northampton and an Anglican minister. He preached a message that centered around the ideas that humans were inherently sinful. God was an angry judge, and individuals needed to ask for forgiveness. He also preached justification by faith alone. In 1741, Edwards gave an infamous and emotional sermon titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. News of this powerful sermon quickly spread throughout the colonies. Edwards is credited for inspiring hundreds of conversions to the Calvinist faith during the 1730s and 1740s. Another important minister was George Whitefield. George Whitefield was actually a minister from Britain. He had several important impacts during the Great Awakening. He toured the colonies up and down the Atlantic coast, preaching his message. In fact, in 1 year alone, he traveled 5,000 miles and preached more than 350 times. He was a theatrical and expressive preacher. He preached to everyone, including the enslaved and Native Americans, and convinced many English colonists to join local churches. Now, the most important things to understand about the Great Awakening in this period of religious revival is that there's a few major themes to understand. All people are born sinners. Sin without salvation will send a person to hell, but all people can be saved if they seek forgiveness. All people have a direct emotional connection to God. Religion should be personal and casual and should never be formalized. All of these were in response to the Enlightenment attack on religion, which occurred in the decades leading up to the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening did not have perfect converts. Many people opposed this new approach to religion. For example, Charles Chauncey, a minister in Boston, was especially critical of Whitefield's preaching. He supported a more traditional and formal style of religion. By about 1742, the Great Awakening had inspired two religious camps: the Old Lights, who wanted to follow the old-fashioned, traditional, formalized church, and the New Lights, who wanted to follow the ideas of the Great Awakening, specifically a more personal and close relationship with God. There are a lot of short and long-term effects, though, that make the Great Awakening worth talking about. Interestingly enough, the First Great Awakening spurred a second in the 1790s. This movement is typically less talked about, but it led to the founding of several important colleges and seminaries. New denominations, especially Methodists and Baptists, grew very quickly. While the movement unified the colonies and boosted church growth, experts say it also caused division among those who supported and those who rejected it. All in all, though, the most important long-term effect of the Great Awakening is that it brought people together from the different colonies to hear these preachers for the first time. People from Pennsylvania met with people from Virginia. People from South Carolina met with people from Georgia. People from Massachusetts traveled to New York, and so on and so forth. The idea of Americanness for the first time became important in the hearts and minds of the colonists. And this is going to lead almost directly to the American Revolution.